On a date recorded in early 2024, an artificial intelligence safety researcher named Mowshowitz began documenting a specific friction point in the development of frontier models. He argued that the United States government was maintaining a legal environment that made safety coordination between competitors a liability. The implication was that being cautious could be interpreted as a violation of antitrust law. This record investigates how these systems quietly drift away from intent, oversight, and control, and what happens when no one is clearly responsible for stopping it. I'm Margaret Ellis. This is Operational Drift. The record shows that the current legal framework for competition assumes that when companies talk to each other, they are doing so to the detriment of the consumer. In most industries, this is called collusion. However, in the context of artificial intelligence, a new argument has emerged. Proponents suggest that frontier labs, specifically the small group of companies developing the most advanced systems, are currently exposed to real legal risk if they coordinate on safety measures. According to these researchers, the law creates a race to the bottom, where the least cautious actor sets the pace for the entire industry because their competitors are legally barred from agreeing to slow down together. In the archives of 2024, Mowshowitz framed this as a low-cost, high-leverage first step for the United States government. He proposed targeted antitrust exemptions. These waivers would allow labs to share evaluation results, discuss dangerous capabilities, and jointly decide on deployment thresholds. Without these exemptions, a lab that chooses to delay a release due to observed risks might be outcompeted by one that ignores those same risks. The cautious lab cannot legally coordinate a response or ask their competitor to match their safety standards without risking a lawsuit for anti-competitive behavior. The system creates a penalty for restraint. According to the record, this idea gained traction in private and semi-public circles. Elon Musk reportedly told Demis Hassabis that he wanted leading artificial intelligence companies to have a regular call to discuss safety and security issues. Commentators like Dave Caston echoed this, suggesting the government should explicitly waive antitrust risks for these specific safety-related interactions. The drift here is subtle, a shift from seeing competition as a safeguard to seeing it as a danger, and seeing coordination, the very thing antitrust law is meant to prevent, as the new safety mechanism. We are witness to a reversal of regulatory logic. This leads to a reported memorandum that included a waiver process. This process allowed agency heads to grant limited exceptions, capped at 1 year, for relationships necessary to responsibly steward United States national security. While this was aimed primarily at government-to-lab relationships, it established a precedent. It signaled that the government was willing to suspend the rules of the market if the technology was deemed significant enough for national security. This is where the operational drift begins to manifest. The rules governing how these companies interact are changing, but the oversight of those interactions remains opaque and largely hidden from public view. In this context, behavior drift means a system changing how it acts without triggering the mechanisms designed to notice change. Here, the system is the regulatory environment. We are seeing a move toward a unipolar or multipolar dilemma, as documented in the records of 2024. The goal is coordination, but the cost is the concentration of authority. When authority concentrates in the absence of transparency, the mechanisms of accountability begin to fail. The record suggests this shift was not accidental, but a deliberate move to bypass the friction of existing law. There are 5 primary pushback points identified in the record against these antitrust exemptions. The first is the risk of regulatory capture dressed up as safety. Skeptics worry that safety coordination is merely a convenient label for incumbent labs, specifically OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google DeepMind, to jointly set industry standards that benefit them. By establishing compute thresholds and release timings, these labs could effectively box out smaller or open-source competitors who are not part of the coordinating group. This creates a barrier to entry that is enforced by the state under the guise of public protection.
History shows that antitrust law's suspicion of competitor coordination
exists because such cooperation has been used to entrench dominant players in other industries. When the record shows a shift towards safety coordination, it rarely details how we distinguish a safety standard from a market barrier. If the leading labs agree that a model requires a specific level of expensive safety testing that only they can afford, they have effectively regulated their competition out of the market. The cost of safety becomes the price of entry, ensuring that only the largest entities can survive the transition. The second issue is the difficulty of separating safety talk from business talk. Once executives are legally permitted to be in a room discussing deployment timing and capability evaluations, there is no documented mechanism to prevent that conversation from drifting into pricing, hiring, or market division. A waiver would need a very narrow, well-monitored scope to avoid becoming a backdoor for ordinary collusion. However, as the record indicates, vague or broad waivers are inherently harder for regulators to police, especially when the subject matter is as complex as frontier model capabilities. Some economists, according to reports from 2024, argue that competitive pressure is actually a safety mechanism in disguise. A crowded, competitive field makes it difficult for any single lab or a small cartel to control the entire trajectory of the technology. By reducing this friction through antitrust waivers, we concentrate power into fewer hands. The safety of the system becomes dependent on the integrity of a very small number of people, rather than the distributed oversight of a market. We are trading the resilience of competition for the perceived stability of a concentrated alliance. Verification remains a significant problem. Even if a waiver is well designed, safety coordination agreements are nearly impossible to verify from the outside. If labs claim they are coordinating to slow down or align safety standards, the public and regulators have no easy way to confirm they aren't using those same channels for anti-competitive ends. The opacity that makes antitrust enforcement difficult is not removed, it is simply shielded by the label of safety. The lack of an independent auditing mechanism means that we are essentially operating on a system of trust in an industry defined by intense competition. Finally, there is the problem of international asymmetry. A United States-only antitrust carve-out does not bind foreign labs. This raises the question of whether domestic coordination meaningfully reduces global racing dynamics, or if it simply consolidates power among a handful of United States firms while the global race continues unabated. The record suggests that proponents like Mowshowitz acknowledge this, eventually wanting to open similar channels with China for monitoring and verification. But the political reality is far more fractured. Domestic safety measures mean little if the global environment remains a high-speed race with no off-ramp. This tension is most visible when we compare the safety coordination narrative with the official White House narrative. The record shows that the current administration views it as a national security imperative for the United States to beat China in the artificial intelligence race. This is a racing framework. Speed and capability advantage are the primary objectives. Anything that slows down United States labs, including safety-motivated caution, is framed as ceding ground to a rival who will not show the same restraint. The conflict between the safety goal and the geopolitical goal is rarely resolved in the documents. Proponents of safety coordination attempt to reconcile this through three different moves. The first is to reframe cooperation as a competitive tool. They argue that by pooling safety research and sharing threat intelligence, the United States bloc becomes stronger collectively. This version of the waiver is tied to national security stewardship and covers threat intelligence sharing rather than actual deployment delays. This is the version that has seen the most political traction, as it aligns with the desire to build a more resilient domestic front against foreign intrusion and corporate espionage. The second move is the argument that safety coordination lets you race faster, not slower. By standardizing security practices and evaluation standards, labs reduce the risk of a catastrophic failure, such as a hack, a scandal, or an accident, that would trigger a public backlash and heavy-handed regulation. In this view, coordination is a way to avoid the scenario where a disaster forces everyone to stop. It is safety as a form of insurance for the race itself. The goal is not to slow down, but to ensure that the speed does not lead to a derailment that ends the competition entirely. The third move, and the one most in tension with the Beat China narrative, is the call for international coordination that includes China. The goal here is mutual restraint and verification. However, there is no documented sign that the current administration is interested in a version of the waiver that allows United States labs to coordinate a slowdown, especially if that slowdown includes international rivals. The documents suggest that any coordination that impacts speed is viewed with extreme skepticism. The priority remains maintaining the lead, even if that lead comes with unquantified risks to system stability. What we observe in the documents is a narrowing of the original proposal. The broader version, where labs coordinate to jointly hold back capabilities for safety reasons, is being replaced by a narrower version focused on threat intelligence and security against foreign espionage. The drift is toward a system where coordination is allowed only if it serves the race, not if it slows it down. This shift changes the fundamental purpose of the antitrust exemption from a safety mechanism to a national security tool. The original concern for model safety is being eclipsed by the necessity of global dominance. In the case of Claude Fable 5 and Claude Mythos, the records from Anthropic suggest a belief that specific versions of models can be managed through these agreements. But as the capabilities of these systems increase, the distinction between a safe deployment and a competitive deployment becomes harder to maintain. The authority to make these decisions is being quietly relocated from the public sphere to the rooms where these coordinated discussions occur. Decisions that affect the global technological landscape are being made by a small number of technical leads and corporate executives, shielded from standard regulatory scrutiny. When we look at the quiet ways policy could go wrong, as Mowshowitz described it in late 2024, the structural prevention of coordination was his primary fear. Yet the counter-fear remains, that the coordination itself becomes the mechanism of drift. If the labs are allowed to decide what constitutes a safety risk without external verification, they become the regulators of their own industry. The drift is the movement from law to discretion, from public oversight to private agreement. We are watching the formation of a shadow regulatory system that operates without the traditional checks of a democratic society. The memorandum's one-year cap on waivers suggests a temporary measure, but the history of such limited exceptions often shows them becoming normalized parts of the institutional landscape. As of 2026, we must ask if these relationships, originally described as necessary for national security, have become the standard operating procedure for the entire frontier artificial intelligence sector. What was once an emergency measure is now a foundational element of the industry's legal architecture. The temporary has become permanent, and the exception has become the rule, without a single public debate on the consequences. According to the researchers, the tension between racing and safety is not just a policy debate, it is a technical reality. If a model like Claude Mythos shows concerning capabilities, the decision to delay it is now wrapped in layers of legal and geopolitical calculation. The drift is no longer just in the system's behavior, but in the oversight mechanisms that were supposed to hold it accountable. The very tools meant to ensure safety are being recalibrated to ensure competitive advantage. This suggests a fundamental misalignment between the stated goals of the labs and the actual incentives of the market they inhabit. We are seeing the formation of a unipolar regulatory structure, where a few labs and a few government agency heads set the trajectory for a technology that impacts the entire global economy. The incentives for these actors to prioritize safety over their own market dominance or national security standing are not clearly established in any filing or system card. The record shows a preference for consolidation over competition, for control over transparency. This concentration of decision-making power creates a single point of failure that could have catastrophic consequences for the public interest, yet the public is excluded from the room. The drift here is the normalization of the safety waiver as a tool for market control.
It is an unintended but predictable outcome of trying to solve a coordination problem within a competitive, high-stakes environment. No one person owned the decision to move toward this cartel-like structure. It emerged from the friction between antitrust law and the perceived existential risks of artificial intelligence. It is a structural drift, where the system itself evolves to protect its most powerful participants at the expense of the original safety objectives. The waiver has become the primary instrument of this evolution.
As we examine the archives from 2024 and 2025, the missing piece is always the verification. How does the public know that the coordination is about safety and not about maintaining the status quo? The record doesn't specify any independent monitoring body that has the authority to audit these coordinated meetings or the deployment thresholds they set. There is no sunshine in these rooms. Without a mechanism for outside review, the claim of safety is just words. We are asked to trust the very entities that are most incentivized to prioritize their own growth over public caution. This lack of transparency is where accountability dissolves. If a coordinated safety decision later proves to be an anti-competitive maneuver, the liability has already been relocated by the waiver itself. The agency heads who granted the exceptions are shielded by the national security mandate, and the labs are shielded by the waiver. Responsibility becomes a game of musical chairs, where no one is left holding the blame when the music stops. The drift ensures that even if something goes wrong, there is no clear path to holding the decision-makers responsible for the outcomes they orchestrated. In the unipolar versus multipolar artificial intelligence dilemma, the documents reveal a preference for a controlled, unipolar approach. The belief is that it is better to have a few labs coordinating safely than hundreds of labs racing recklessly. But this assumes the coordination remains focused on safety. The drift suggests that once the competitive pressure is removed, the lab's alignment with public intent becomes even harder to verify. We are trading a chaotic race for a coordinated march in an unknown direction. The fundamental question is whether that march is any safer than the race it replaced. We see this in the framing of threat intelligence sharing. While standardizing defenses against espionage is a clear national security benefit, it also creates a shared technical baseline among the frontier labs. This shared baseline makes it easier for them to move as a single unit, further distancing them from the rest of the industry and the public. The coordination intended to secure the technology also serves to secure the market position of the participants. The drift has converted a security protocol into a barrier that ensures no new actors can disrupt the existing order of power. Operational drift is not the point where something breaks. It is the point where the break is accepted as normal operation. The suspension of competition rules for the sake of artificial intelligence safety has become a normal operation, even if the safety benefits remain undocumented and unverified. We are living in a period where the exception has been folded into the foundation of how these companies function. The break in the law is no longer seen as a break. It is seen as the necessary architecture for the development of the most powerful technology in human history. As the race with China continues to dominate the administration's narrative, the broader coordination Zvi Mowshowitz argued for, the one that includes international rivals, remains a marginal idea. The record shows we have chosen a path of domestic consolidation under the label of safety, while the global racing dynamics remain fundamentally unchanged. The drift has narrowed our focus to a domestic alliance, leaving the global risks to be sorted out by the same racing incentives that caused the problem. We have built a castle for our labs, while the storm outside only grows in intensity. This was already happening. Today is just when we noticed. The legal frameworks that were designed to ensure fair competition are being quietly dismantled for a technology that no one yet knows how to control. The authority is accumulating in rooms where the public is not invited, under waivers that the public cannot review. The drift is complete when the system no longer requires public consent to function. We are reaching a point where the major labs and the security state are so intertwined that their interests are indistinguishable from one another, leaving the public interest behind. In the records of 2024, the fear was that antitrust law would kill artificial intelligence safety.
In the records of 2026, the question is whether the pursuit of safety has killed the very competition and transparency that were supposed to keep the labs accountable. We have traded one risk for another, but we have yet to see if the trade was worth the cost. The accountability mechanisms of the past are being replaced by the promises of a few powerful actors, and we have no way to ensure those promises are kept.
We are left with a system that coordinates to compete, rather than one that competes to be safe. The shift is complete, but the outcome is unresolved. If the primary labs are now legally allowed to act as one, who is left to notice when they all drift in the same dangerous direction? The record shows that when coordination replaces competition, the first thing to disappear is the dissenting voice. Without that voice, the drift becomes invisible until it is too late to correct. The coordination that was supposed to save us may be the very thing that makes the system uncontrollable. The record remains open on how a safety coordination agreement can be distinguished from a market cartel when both are conducted behind the shield of national security. We still don't know who, if anyone, has the authority to revoke a waiver once it becomes essential to a lab's business model. If the waiver becomes the baseline for operation, the ability to regulate the industry is effectively lost to the very companies the government was supposed to oversee. The documents do not provide an answer to how this power will be returned to the public sphere. Operational drift isn't the point where something breaks. It is the point where the break is accepted as normal operation. Responsibility doesn't disappear. It relocates to the dark corners of the bureaucracy, where decisions are made without names and consequences are managed without accountability. The relocation of this responsibility is the final step in the drift of the system away from public intent. We are left watching a system that no longer feels the need to explain itself to those it is meant to serve. If safety coordination becomes the new standard for market entry, we must ask, whose safety are we actually protecting, and what happened to the oversight we were promised? The answer is not in the system cards or the public press releases. It is in the documents we have yet to see, in the meeting minutes that remain classified, and in the private agreements that now govern the future of the technology. The record is silent on these matters, and in that silence, the drift continues unchecked. We are left to wonder who is truly at the wheel. Sources for this record are available at operationaldrift.neuralnewscast.com. Neural Newscast is AI-assisted, human-reviewed. View our AI transparency policy at neuralnewscast.com. This program adheres to the Neural Newscast Network transparency policy.